The former South African President F.W. de Klerk has passed on at the age of 85. The details surrounding his death are, according to his representative spokesperson at the F.W. de Klerk, were due to the cancer complications. For more on the former president's legacy, I'm now joined by our politics editor, Mr. Sbu Ngalwa. Mr. Ngalwa, good to have you with us on the Daytime Update. Now, when we talk of F.W. de Klerk, what comes to mind? How do you believe he will be remembered, his role in South African politics?
I think it will be a mixed legacy, and depending on where one falls on the political divide, because the momentous occasions obviously would be that probably that famous speech that he made in 1990, where he announced the unbanning of the ANC and other political liberation movements, and also when he announced the release of former President Nelson Mandela. And others will also remember the fact that he was actually apartheid's last president, and the fact that for almost all his adult life he had actually served the National Party and served apartheid and played different roles in service of apartheid as a Minister of Planning, as a Minister of Energy, as a Minister of Education, up to a point, I think it was probably between 1972 and 1989, when he took over the leadership of the National Party at the time when P.W. Botha fell ill and became president until 94. Yes, he did take us through that very important transition between 1990 and 1994. And you can remember, you can probably understand the difficulty, how difficult it would have been for him, because apartheid served the white people of South Africa. It served them. There was no, besides the fact that there had been sanctions that had been imposed, and the last country to impose sanctions being forced by its parliament or legislature was the United States, which meant that apartheid had there was no way out. So in a way, he had to end apartheid, but it was still not an easy transition. So I think that mixed reaction, and also that mixed understanding or even legacy will be what will be playing out in the days between now and probably his funeral, which will be a state funeral, given the fact that he is a former president, and also he did serve a democratic government, actually.
So let's talk about that transition and when he came into power. Yes, he was serving the apartheid government from 72 to the release of the former president and the negotiations, because he was president when those negotiations actually started, and he spearheaded that entire transitionary process. What was his positioning? What was his narrative? How was he explaining the move from an apartheid South Africa to one where now there was going to end up being a government of national unity?
Look, the reality is that I know most people like to sanitize our history and present it as though it was a magnanimous decision from the side of de Klerk, who wanted an end to apartheid. Apartheid had reached a cul-de-sac. There was no way else. Remember, apartheid...
It just happened to be on his watch. Exactly.
And he was the person who actually still had to convince a section of the population that this is the end of the road. And remember, by 1989, 1990, the Afrikaner intelligentsia, your business leaders, your academics had already gone to talk to the ANC in exile from as early as 1986. So by the time that he becomes president, there were already talks. And it was actually, my understanding, and I stand corrected, that it was in 1986 when the United States House of Representatives actually adopted the law that imposed sanctions on South Africa. So that was the context. And also remember, had it not been for the support of the United States, and I would say also the United Kingdom, apartheid would not have survived for as long as it did. But because of the strong and a vibrant and also a successful international anti-apartheid campaign, they were able to see more countries imposing sanctions on apartheid South Africa long after the United Nations had declared it a crime against humanity. So he will be remembered as that man who's also participated actually in the democratic government, where in that government of national unity he was a deputy president. But there was still, Thami, a difficult period between 1990 and 1994, because even though there were negotiations and there was CODESA, there was still a lot of mistrust, and the apartheid forces were still carrying out raids and killing people in various communities. I think Boipatong comes to mind. There were also the issue of black-on-black violence, which in later years it became clear that it had been state-sponsored. And I think the people of Umtata actually will remember the Mpendulo twins, the 16-year-olds who were killed by apartheid SADF members who stormed the house in Mtata and mowed down 3 teenagers in Mtata. So, and there was never any repercussion. There was never any, no one was ever brought to book for that. So that is the kind of legacy we're dealing with here. And I'm sure we will hear a lot more over the next few hours, over the next few days. And most people who will reflect this very legacy, who will actually be more knowledgeable about even some of the anecdotes. I can think of people here like your Roof Mayors, your people like your Paulo Jordans, your Mark Maharajas, and people who actually were with him in the National Party towards its death. People who would have left the National Party, joined the ANC, and some who would have left the National Party and joined the DA, and when there was that breakup between the National Party and the DA, who never went back to a national party that was reconfigured under Martinus van Schalkwyk. So
talk to us about the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993. It was jointly awarded to former President Datu Madiba and F.W. de Klerk. Talk to us about that.
I think for the Nobel Committee, it was important to reflect what was happening in South Africa. And the fact that, and I think it's something worth noting, the fact that we had a bloodless transition in this country. And that it had, given the fact that we had a liberation struggle, and everyone had believed, in fact, even within the liberation forces, at the time when they were told to put down their arms, there was unhappiness in the camps. And that caused a lot of reaction, particularly in the ANC, in the MK camps, when they were told to put down the arms. So the efforts that brought us to 1994 were not small, or were not, are not something we can sneeze at. Those were important moments. And the 2 men who stood towering over that process was one, Tol Madiba, and a F.W. de Klerk, being the president, last president of apartheid, who has to convince not just his cabinet or their supporters, but also the broader South African white community that believed that this was the end of the world as they knew. Yes, it was the end of apartheid as they knew it, but they thought that it spelled doom for them. So he had to be part of that process, although there was mistrust between the parties given the history. I think it was still a moment which was worth reflecting, and I still believe that the Nobel Committee in that regard, given the facts that they were faced with at the time, they actually made the right decision by awarding the 2 men the Nobel Peace Prize.
One area of our transition from apartheid South Africa to democratic South Africa that perhaps needs a bit more attention, and if we could focus on that now, is that period between 94 to 96 when he was working alongside Datu Madiba as his deputy. What characterized that era? Because a lot of what happened during that time reflects on the economic policies of South Africa, it reflects on labor, it reflects on the status quo. That is when the blueprint for post-South Africa was actually put in place and set in stone. Your thoughts on his contribution and where maybe you see his influence?
I think, Thami, coming into the government of national unity and being the second deputy president under Madiba must have taken a lot from him, because remember, at some point Mandela was a prisoner and he was president, and de Klerk was president. He's the man who freed a Nelson Mandela. Yes, there was a period of negotiations. There were those TV debates which we don't have anymore. I'm sure it would be great to have presidential debates like we had with Nelson Mandela and actually F.W. de Klerk boxing in a studio. So given all of that, coming to 1994 and agreeing to be a deputy president, I think he understood and he would have realized the importance of making sure that the bloodless transition that we had is carried through. But also, I think it was important in terms of reassuring the white community that they had not given up. The apartheid ministers and also the National Party was still part of this transition to get people to buy into it. But remember also that we still had a George Fivers in the police, and we had a Chris Stiles as the governor of the Reserve Bank. So that transition period was actually a crucial period. That's why sometimes I think even when we're talking about Madiba's legacy, there are people who say Mandela sold out, and as though they would have probably done better, which is actually nonsense. If you understood what was happening in this, if one reads through the literature, you can understand how delicate that period was. And remember, also, I think there was that famous interview. I think Mandela was in the United States where he was asked about the economic direction of South Africa, and he batted off that question quite intelligently, where he said it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mice, which floored the anchor. You know? So there were all those jitters, and it was important for also a leadership of Mandela and then de Klerk to say that you can remain, all those companies can remain in South Africa, and that South Africa was a place that would carry through. And look at us now, we're still here as a country.
Sbu Ngalwa, very much appreciated. That's Sbu Ngalwa, our politics editor, as we retrace the legacy of the now late last president of apartheid South Africa, F.W. de Klerk.